The rain wasn't just falling. It was drumming against the roof in a way that made every other sound in the house feel muffled and distant. I was sitting on my sofa with a laptop balanced on my knees, trying to finish a report that was already 3 days overdue. The clock on the wall ticked toward midnight, and the only light in the room came from the pale blue glow of the computer screen and the occasional flicker of lightning from outside. I wasn't expecting anyone, which is why the sudden, sharp notification from my phone made me jump nearly out of my skin. It was my front porch camera app, sending an alert that it had detected human movement. I frowned, wondering if it was just a stray cat or perhaps a branch caught in the wind, but when I tapped the notification, my blood turned to ice. On the grainy night vision feed, a man was standing directly in front of my door. He wasn't knocking, and he wasn't ringing the bell. He was simply standing there, perfectly still, holding a large thermal delivery bag in his left hand. He wore a bright yellow rain poncho that looked sickly and pale under the infrared light of the camera. His face was tilted down, hidden by the deep shadow of his hood, but he was close enough that I could see the rain beaded on the plastic of his coat. I waited for him to leave, assuming he had the wrong house, but 5 minutes passed and he did not move a single inch. He stood like a statue, staring at the wood of my front door as if he could see right through it. Why wasn't he checking his phone for the address? Why wasn't he walking back to a car? I looked past him into the street, but there was no vehicle idling at the curb. He had walked here, in a torrential downpour, just to stand on my porch with a bag of food I never ordered. I felt a cold bead of sweat roll down my spine as I realized the delivery was just a prop to give him a reason to be there if a neighbor looked out their window. I crept toward the hallway, keeping my body low so I wouldn't be seen through the side lights of the door. I reached out and double-checked the deadbolt, my fingers trembling as they touched the cold metal. "Can I help you?" I called out, my voice cracking slightly despite my attempt to sound firm. "I didn't order anything. You have the wrong house." There was no verbal response, but the man slowly lifted his head. He didn't look at the door. He looked directly into the lens of the security camera. He knew I was watching him. A slow, jagged grin spread across his face, and then he did something that made my heart stop. He reached into the delivery bag, but he didn't pull out a pizza or a container of takeout. He pulled out a long, heavy pair of bolt cutters. He didn't go for the front door lock. Instead, he turned and began to walk slowly around the side of my house, toward the gate that led to the backyard. I scrambled to the kitchen, my mind racing through every possible entry point. The sliding glass door in the back was the weakest link, and I knew the lock on it was nothing more than a simple latch. I heard the unmistakable clink of metal hitting metal as he snapped the padlock on my side gate. He was in my backyard now, shielded from the street and the eyes of any passing cars. The house felt like a tomb, and the rhythmic sound of the rain was now my enemy, masking the sound of his footsteps. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but as I looked at the screen, another notification popped up. Rear camera, motion detected. I switched the feed just in time to see the yellow poncho disappear under the eaves of my back porch. Then, the house went pitch black. He had found the external breaker box and cut the power. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Without the hum of the refrigerator or the whir of the air conditioner, the house felt unnervingly large. I stood in the center of the kitchen, clutching a heavy cast iron pan, my eyes straining to adjust to the darkness. I could hear the sliding glass door groan as he applied pressure to it. The sound of the glass vibrating in its frame was like a scream in my ears. I knew I couldn't stay in the kitchen. If he broke through that glass, he would be on top of me in seconds. I retreated into the narrow hallway that led to the attic stairs, moving by memory and touch. I climbed the wooden slats, my breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps, and pulled the ladder up behind me just as I heard the shattering of glass downstairs. The sound of him entering the house was terrifyingly casual. He wasn't rushing. He was walking through my living room, his boots squeaking on the hardwood floors. I lay flat on the attic floor, pressing my ear against the wood, listening to him move from room to room. He was looking for me, checking the closets and the space under the beds with a terrifying patience. "I know you're in here somewhere," he whispered, his voice drifting up through the floorboards. It was a low, gravelly sound that didn't belong in a home. "The food is getting cold." He reached the hallway directly beneath the attic hatch. I held my breath, my lungs burning, terrified that even the sound of my heartbeat would give me away. I saw the handle of the attic hatch move slightly as he pushed against it, but because I had pulled the ladder up and locked the manual bolt from the inside, it didn't budge. He stayed there for what felt like hours, leaning against the wall just inches below me. I could hear him tapping the bolt cutters against his palm, a rhythmic, metallic sound that signaled his frustration. Eventually, the sound of the rain began to fade, and the first gray light of dawn started to seep through the tiny vent in the attic gable. I didn't move until I heard the distant sound of a siren. My neighbor, a light sleeper who had noticed my power go out and seen a strange figure in a yellow poncho exiting my back fence, had finally called the police. When the officers arrived and cleared the house, they found the thermal delivery bag sitting in the middle of my kitchen table. Inside wasn't food. It was a collection of printed photos of me, taken from outside my windows over the last 3 weeks. He hadn't just come to visit that night. He had been planning that visit for a very long time. I survived, but I never spent another night in that house. And even now, every time I hear a notification on my phone, my hand shakes as I reach to check the screen. I used to believe that living on the 12th floor of a luxury building meant I was untouchable. I pay a premium for the key fob elevators, the heavy fire-rated doors, and the feeling that the world stays outside where it belongs. But I learned that night that locks are only as good as the person who isn't supposed to have a key. It began at exactly 1:15 in the morning. I was lying in bed, the city lights reflecting off my ceiling in long, jagged streaks of neon orange and white. The building was usually silent at that hour, save for the distant hum of the ventilation system. Then, I heard a sound that didn't belong. It was a metallic clink, followed by the unmistakable sliding of a key into a lock. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My mind immediately tried to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was my neighbor, drunk and at the wrong door. Maybe the maintenance man had an emergency repair. But then the key turned. It hit a dead end, the wrong tumblers refusing to give way. There was a soft, frustrated sigh from the other side of the wood. Then came the second key. Slide, turn, click. It didn't fit either. I sat up slowly, the silk sheets rustling like dry leaves in the silence of the room. I didn't turn on the lamp. I didn't want whoever was out there to know I was awake. I crept toward the hallway, my bare feet silent on the cold hardwood floor. I reached the front door and peered through the tiny glass peephole. The hallway light was bright, casting a sterile glow over the patterned carpet. Standing there was a man in a pristine maintenance uniform. He didn't look like a burglar. He looked like he belonged there. He had a massive ring of keys in his hand, hundreds of them, shimmering like silver coins. He was methodical. He would try a key, it wouldn't work, and he would move to the next one on the ring. "Who is it?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The man stopped. He didn't look at the peephole. He just stared at the handle. "Maintenance. There is a leak in 1204. I need to check your pipes. I'm in 1208. I replied, my heart hammering against my ribs. "You have the wrong unit. 1204 is down the hall. The leak is traveling," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of any emotion or urgency. "Open the door, please. It will only take a moment." "I'm not opening the door," I said, my hand reaching for my phone on the entryway table. "Call the front desk. Have them verify you." The scraping sound started again. Slide, turn, click. He wasn't leaving. He was just continuing his task. He was going through the keys one by one, looking for the master that would grant him entry into my private world. I realized with a jolt of horror that he wasn't maintenance at all. He was someone who had stolen a master set, or perhaps an old employee who knew the system. I dialed the front desk, but the line just rang and rang. That's when I remembered the construction on the lobby level. The phone lines had been glitchy all week. I was 12 stories up, trapped in a box of concrete and glass, while a man with 1,000 keys stood inches away from my throat. Slide, turn, click. The sound was hypnotic and terrifying. I looked at my door handle. It was a heavy, reinforced lever, but it wasn't invincible. I ran to my kitchen and grabbed my heavy dining chair, wedging it under the handle. Then, I dragged my heavy oak bookshelf across the floor. The wood screeched against the floorboards, a sound so loud it surely should have alerted the neighbors. But the walls in this building were thick. In the silence of the night, I was truly alone. "I'm calling the police now," I shouted, hoping the threat would be enough. "The police are busy tonight." The voice responded from the hallway. "There was a multi-car pileup on the bridge. They won't be here for 20 minutes. I only need 5. The sound of the keys accelerated. He was flipping through them faster now, his patience finally wearing thin. I looked around my apartment, searching for an exit. The balcony. It was my only choice. I ran to the sliding glass door and stepped out into the cold night air. The wind whipped around me, smelling of rain and exhaust. I looked over the railing. It was a straight drop to the pavement 12 stories below. But my neighbor's balcony was only 4 feet away, separated by a frosted glass divider. I looked back at my front door. I could hear the wood beginning to groan as he put his weight against it. One of the keys must have finally caught a tumbler, because I heard the first of the 3 locks click open. I didn't think. I climbed onto the railing of my balcony, my hands slick with sweat as I gripped the cold metal. I reached over the glass divider, straining to find a handhold on the neighbor's side. Below me, the city was a blur of motion, but up here, time had slowed to a crawl. I swung my leg over, my heart in my mouth, and pulled myself onto the adjacent balcony just as I heard my own front door fly open and hit the bookshelf with a violent crash. I scrambled to the neighbor's sliding door and began pounding on the glass. "Help!" I screamed. "Call 911. Inside, a light flickered on. An elderly woman appeared, her face pale with confusion and fear. She saw me, saw my terrified expression, and immediately grabbed her phone. Behind me, through the glass divider, I saw the man step out onto my balcony. He was holding a roll of heavy-duty duct tape and a small, jagged blade. He looked at me through the frosted glass. He didn't try to climb over. He knew the game was up. He simply turned around and walked back into my apartment, disappearing into the shadows of the home he had worked so hard to enter. When the police arrived 10 minutes later, my apartment was empty. The only sign he had been there was the front door standing wide open and the massive ring of keys left sitting on my kitchen counter. Every single key on that ring had been filed down to a specific shape. He hadn't been looking for the right key. He had been testing a bump key system designed to bypass almost any standard lock in the building. I don't live on the 12th floor anymore. I live in a house with a dog, a security system that doesn't rely on phone lines, and a deadbolt that doesn't have a keyhole at all. Because I know now that the higher up you are, the further you have to fall when someone finally finds the right key. I used to love the large, floor-to-ceiling windows of my studio apartment because they let the moonlight dance across the floor while I slept. But I never considered that while I was looking out at the world was looking back at me. It was 3 in the morning, and the city outside was draped in a thick, unnatural fog that swallowed the streetlights and turned the trees into twisted, skeletal shapes. I was sitting at my desk, the only light in the room coming from my monitor, when I saw a flicker of movement in the reflection of the glass. At first, I thought it was just my own shadow shifting as I reached for my coffee, but then I realized that the figure in the reflection wasn't moving when I moved. It was standing perfectly still, right behind my shoulder, just outside the glass. I didn't turn around. My breath hitched in my throat, and I felt a cold, prickling sensation spread across my scalp. I stared at the dark shape in the reflection. It was a man, wearing a heavy coat and a brimmed hat that obscured his features. He was standing less than 2 feet away from me, separated only by a single pane of tempered glass. How long had he been standing there? How many nights had he watched me sleep or work from the safety of the shadows? I slowly moved my hand toward my phone, but as soon as my fingers brushed the screen, the man tapped on the glass. It wasn't a loud knock. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like the sound of a fingernail clicking against a tooth. Tap.
Top.
Tap. The sound vibrated through the desk and into my bones. I forced myself to turn around, my chair creaking in the silence. He didn't flinch when I looked at him. He just stood there, his face a pale blur in the darkness, and pointed a long finger toward the bottom corner of the window. I looked down and felt my stomach drop. He had already removed the rubber weather stripping from the base of the glass. He wasn't just watching, he was dismantling the barrier between us. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, professional suction cup tool used by glaziers. He was planning to lift the entire pane out of its frame without making a single sound. "I've already called the police," I lied, my voice shaking so hard I could barely get the words out. He didn't say a word. He simply applied the suction cup to the glass and began to pull, the frame groaning as the seal started to fail. I realized that in less than a minute, there would be nothing but open air between me and a man who had clearly spent weeks studying my routine. I backed away toward the bathroom, the only room in the studio with a solid wooden door and a working lock. But as I reached the threshold, I saw him stop pulling. He looked toward the front door of my apartment and tilted his head as if listening to something. Then he smiled, a wide, toothy grin that didn't reach his eyes. I heard a soft click from the hallway. He wasn't alone. The man at the window was the distraction, the one meant to keep my eyes fixed on the glass while his partner worked on the front door lock. I was being squeezed from both sides. The front door began to push inward, the chain bolt straining against the wood, while the man at the window gave one final, violent tug. The heavy glass pane popped out of its track with a sickening thud, leaning inward toward my desk. I didn't wait to see him climb through. I ran into the bathroom, slammed the door, and shoved my shoulder against it just as I heard the front door chain snap. I was trapped in a 5-by-5-foot space with no window and no secondary exit. I heard them meeting in the center of my room. They didn't whisper. They spoke in low, calm tones, like two contractors discussing a renovation project. "Is she in the bathroom?" One voice asked. "Yeah. She's got nowhere to go now," the other replied. I looked around the small bathroom, my eyes landing on the heavy porcelain lid of the toilet tank. I grabbed it, my muscles screaming from the weight, and held it over my head. Then, I saw the small ventilation duct near the ceiling. It was too small for a person to crawl through, but it led directly to the apartment next door. I began to scream into the vent. I didn't scream for help. I screamed, "Fire! Fire!" at the top of my lungs. I knew that people often ignore screams of distress, thinking it's just a domestic dispute, but everyone reacts to the threat of a fire. Within seconds, I heard the smoke alarm in the neighboring unit go off as my neighbor, a paranoid smoker, panicked and hit his test button. I heard the hallway fill with the sound of doors opening and people shouting. The two men in my apartment froze. They knew that a crowded hallway meant they couldn't make a clean escape. I heard the sound of footsteps sprinting back toward the broken window. I waited, clutching the porcelain lid until my knuckles turned white, listening as the sirens finally began to wail in the distance. When the fire department broke down my bathroom door, they found me standing in the bathtub, ready to fight a shadow that had already vanished into the fog. They never caught the men, but they found something tucked into the frame of my window the next morning. It was a small, hand-drawn map of my apartment, with every light switch, every lock, and every hiding spot marked in red ink. I don't live in a studio anymore. I live on the 4th floor of a brick building with no balconies and no glass walls, because I know now that some visitors don't want to come through the door. They want to become part of the house itself.